Welcome to this explainer. Okay, today we're taking a pretty fascinating journey to demystify how everyday objects right around you actually connect to these massive global economic structures. I mean, have you ever looked at a simple piece of furniture or, maybe the very device you're watching this on and just wondered about the invisible economic machinery that brought it to life? Well, we are going to break down exactly how businesses are classified, how they all operate together, and ultimately, who controls them. Let's get into it.
So here's our agenda for today. We're looking at 1. The 3 economic sectors, 2. Measuring sector importance, 3. How economies evolve, 4. The mixed economy, and 5. The privatization debate.
Section 1. The 3 economic sectors. Okay, let's dive right into this.
Let's ground all this in the classic chain of production. Think about a simple wooden table, right? It actually passes through 3 totally distinct phases. First, you've got the primary extraction, literally chopping down the raw wood. Then, the secondary manufacturing by a furniture maker who actually builds the thing. And finally, the tertiary retail stage, where it's sitting in a shop waiting for a consumer to buy it. 3 steps representing 3 very different types of businesses.
So, starting at the beginning, the primary sector is basically the raw foundation of everything we consume. This sector is entirely focused on extracting and using natural resources to produce raw materials. We're talking about the people and businesses out there physically working with the earth, farming crops, catching fish, managing forestry, or mining valuable stuff like oil and copper. Literally, without the primary sector, the rest of the economy has absolutely nothing to build with. Then, those raw materials get handed off to the secondary sector for transformation. This is where the physical creation actually happens. The secondary sector takes those raw materials from the primary sector and manufactures or processes them into actual goods. And this ranges from the massive scale like car manufacturing and aircraft assembly, right down to your local bakery turning raw flour and sugar into a loaf of bread.
And finally, we hit the tertiary sector. Now, notice something here. This stage doesn't actually produce a physical object at all. Instead, the tertiary sector provides services to consumers and to other businesses. It's all about delivery, support, and the overall experience. It covers a huge variety of industries. Think about the banking system handling your money, the transport networks moving goods around the world, the retail shops where you finally buy that wooden table, plus things like insurance, hotels, and healthcare. It's a massive category.
Section 2. Measuring sector importance. Now let's zoom out from our individual wooden table and look at entire nations. We want to see how these sectors determine a whole country's economic landscape. Economists figure out a sector's importance by looking at the percentage of the workforce it employs and the value of its output. Basically, how much money those goods and services are actually worth compared to the national total. When you look at the global data, a super clear pattern pops up. Developing nations often lean heavily on the primary sector, like farming. And why is that? Well, when average incomes are lower, a huge portion of the workforce just has to focus on basic survival and raw material production. There simply isn't a lot of disposable income lying around to fuel demand for tertiary services like travel or insurance. On the flip side, developed countries are usually dominated by the tertiary sector. Just to put that into perspective, in the UK, a staggering 75% of the workforce is employed in services. It's huge.
Now, what's really interesting about this data is the contrast it shows between developing economies. If we look back at 2017, take Papua New Guinea. They had a really significant primary sector, sitting at 35%, but a relatively small secondary sector at 13%. Compare that to India. Their primary sector output was lower, at 17%, while their manufacturing, the secondary sector, was double that of Papua New Guinea at 26%. But here is the kicker. Despite those big differences in raw materials and manufacturing, both nations are showing massive growth in their tertiary sectors. They're both producing well over 50% of their national output through services alone. It really shows that even very diverse economies eventually tend to shift towards service-driven models.
Section 3. How economies evolve.
Economies aren't just static things. They're highly dynamic, almost like living systems. The dominant sectors in a country will change pretty dramatically over time as a nation develops, adopts new tech, and integrates with the global market. One of the absolute biggest evolutionary steps for a developed economy is deindustrialization. This happens when the secondary or manufacturing sector starts to decline in importance. Now, it's really important to note, this doesn't necessarily mean a country is failing. Actually, scratch that, it's more like a natural pivot. As nations get wealthier and more advanced, they often naturally transition away from heavy factory manufacturing, kind of letting emerging nations handle that, while they focus heavily on high-end services, technology, and finance.
To really see this in action, consider the surprising figure of just 4%. Back in the 1950s, South Korea's economy was heavily dependent on farming, the primary sector. But as they aggressively developed and modernized, their entire economy completely transformed. By 2017, the primary sector accounted for just 4% of their total national output. No way, right? And meanwhile, their services sector had absolutely jumped to an incredible 54%. That is literally the power of economic evolution right there.
Section 4. The mixed economy.
So, having looked at what businesses make, let's change gears and look at who actually owns them. Because structural reality dictates that nearly every country on Earth operates a mixed economy. And this brilliantly illustrates how the production of goods and services is split between two very different groups. In a mixed economy, there's a fundamental divide. On one side, we have the private sector. These are businesses owned by private individuals, and the primary objective, it's simple, to make a profit. The owners hold all the power to decide exactly what to produce and what price to charge for it. Then, on the other side, we have the public sector. This is owned by the government or the state, and their objective is radically different. Their goal is to provide essential services to the public, things like healthcare, education, or national defense. Here, the government decides what is needed, and a lot of times, these services are completely free to the user at the point of access, because they're funded collectively by taxpayers. So it's two totally different objectives operating right side by side.
Section 5. The privatization debate.
Now, when a government actually decides to shift the ownership of a business from the public sector over to the private sector, it creates this really intense economic tug-of-war. Which brings us to a core question we really need to look at strictly impartially. Why do governments privatize? I mean, why take a massive state-owned entity, like a national railway or a water supplier, and just sell it off to private individuals and investors?
So, the crucial point is objectively understanding the economic arguments in favor of making this shift. Proponents of privatization basically point to three major benefits. First up, efficiency. Private businesses are inherently driven by profit, which means they are heavily incentivized to control their costs and eliminate any waste. Second, capital. Private owners and shareholders can often inject way more investment money into a business than a cash-strapped government ever could. And third, competition. Think about it. If a former government monopoly is opened up to private market competition, those new competing firms have to fight for your business, and that can theoretically improve the overall quality of the products and services for the consumer.
But we absolutely must flip the coin here, because these shifts come with some really significant inherent risks that opponents are quick to highlight. The first major risk is unemployment. If a newly privatized firm is desperately trying to increase its efficiency and maximize that profit margin, well, their quickest route is often firing workers and cutting jobs. The second profound risk involves social objectives. Remember, the public sector is designed from the ground up to provide essential services for the good of society. When a business gets privatized, that focus naturally shifts from helping society to making money for the shareholders. Services that just aren't profitable might simply get shut down, completely regardless of the public's need for them. Which leaves us with a pretty heavy final thought to ponder. We've traced the whole economy, right? From the primary extraction of raw materials, through the manufacturing of the secondary sector, all the way to the massive service industries of the tertiary sector. We've seen how economies naturally evolve and how they try to balance private profit with the public good. But looking at your own country's economic structure, if it were to privatize its most essential, life-sustaining services today, who really profits tomorrow? It's a very delicate balance of power, profit, and public welfare. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the economics all around you.